Manufacturing 2023, Driving Resiliency in the Face of Economic Hardship, sponsored by Tulip. My name is Dennis Semeka, Technology Editor of Industry Week. I would now like to welcome today's speakers. Patrick Harrigan, Head of Global Partnerships and Strategic Alliances at Tulip, has over 10 years' experience in manufacturing technology, delivering digital transformation solutions for Fortune 500 manufacturing customers. With his exceptional understanding of manufacturing business processes, Patrick's goal is to work with businesses to identify how technology can be leveraged to deliver disruptive enterprise solutions. Darpan Parikh, Global Solution Leader for Manufacturing Operations at Amazon Web Services, a trusted advisor to business and IT leaders, has over 20 years of experience partnering with global manufacturing enterprises to leverage digital technologies and deliver value-led, smart manufacturing transformation. He leverages his contextual knowledge to continuously optimize and innovate on behalf of customers striving for operational excellence. For more information about Patrick and Darpan, check out the Speaker Details tab on your console. Welcome, gentlemen. And with that, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dennis. So, regarding the agenda today, there's really three major topics we want to talk about. Again, the key component here is all centered around how we drive resiliency moving forward in 2023 and beyond. First, I think it's important to understand some of the trends in the market that we're seeing now. Secondarily, what the landscape looks like for the rest of 2023 and beyond from our perspective. And then certainly how we help to navigate and address this triple squeeze and some recommendations and ideas that can be implemented within your organization, ultimately to help navigate these treacherous times, or unknown times is the best way I could put it. Okay, so I'm not sure. I wish we were in a room where I could ask everyone to sort of raise their hand to understand how many people might have heard of the triple squeeze that Gartner has recently been producing a lot of content around. But really, this is the idea of a combination of factors that are really coming down on the manufacturing industry, and ultimately, a combination of the challenges that we're going to be facing moving forward. They're pretty self-explanatory, but I want to walk through each of them a little bit in depth. Inflation certainly is something that we're seeing within our manufacturing customers, driving costs and ultimately what we refer to as waste into our operations. It's a major challenge, and most CEOs and CFOs are anticipating moving forward. It's going to be a challenge that we'll have to continue to address. Certainly, since 2020, both supply chain disruptions and labor challenges have been the top two issues that most of our manufacturing customers report facing. And unfortunately, if you were to ask me 3 years ago if these supply chain disruptions and labor challenges would have persisted for 3+ years, I would have thought you were crazy. But unfortunately, these are the times we're in. And as such, we need to start figuring out how we address this long term, because ultimately these challenges are here to stay for the foreseeable future. And last but not least, it's how do we start to, within the manufacturing sector, how do these factors really affect us directly, right? The impact on the manufacturing industry. And there's really a few different ways in which we look at this. So historically, manufacturing always looked at how do we drive efficiencies within our process. And efficiencies, while got us up to this point, unfortunately won't be able to carry us through alone through these challenging times, right? And as such, we need to shift focus and look at how we really develop resiliency within our processes. And resiliency in this context are how do we deploy operations and processes that are flexible, that allow us to address not only the known challenges in our business, but knowing that unknowns are right around the corner. And how do we put not only operations in place and change management processes and organizational structures in place, but how do we leverage software alongside that in order to address these challenges? Now, Darpan, I know they did a quick introduction, but I know you've spent a tremendous amount of time in this space along with myself. I'd love to maybe get your opinion on what you're seeing in the market as it relates to sort of these challenges and how people are looking to address them.
Thank you, Patrick, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending upon wherever you are joining from. And I think, Patrick, as you called out, Yes, I think from an industry perspective, there are a few challenges that have, I would say, been there for decades, right? But what has really changed now, in my view, is I think a lot of that is now getting together and converging, if you will, right? So from that perspective, like the way you said, I think efficiency is something that has been what I think a lot of manufacturers have historically focused on. But now when it comes to the current times, especially what we prefer calling out as triple squeeze, I think that is not something that will allow you to survive, if you will, right? And you need to think beyond in terms of what really are the trends that are going to impact your business, kind of, I would say, ideally foresee those to an extent that you can, and then start preparing yourself for embracing that change versus, I would say, being taken for a surprise, if you will, right? And so, again, to kind of sum it up, if you ask me, I think there are two things for sure that I see here, right? Number one, the future is incredibly complex. It is going to be increasingly complex than what it has been and what it is today. And a larger chunk of that complexity is what I would attribute to the unknowns, as you called out, Patrick, right? So that's number one. And number two, because of that, I would say change is going to be the only constant, right? So these are the two things that I definitely, I'm certain, at least in the midterm, over the next 2 to 3 years, is something that everyone is going to experience. If I can, I would probably call this as the new normal, right? What I would call as the age of continuous disruptions, if you will, right? And as you already called out, I think the key would be to use this as an opportunity, and you use this as a reason to not just survive, but I would say sustainably thrive and create value for your organization as well as for the larger ecosystem. The other thing, Patrick, is I think during such times when I would say there is I would not say a healthy mix, but I would say a lot of unknowns in terms of what is within your control and what is a lot of things that are beyond your control. The importance has to shift from efficiency into resilience, right? And that's where I would say resilience, in my view, in very simplified terms, I would probably call it as the capability of an organization to recover, absorb, or avoid any negative impacts from these disruptions, right? And in that context is where I would say, you need to leverage digital and cloud capabilities to innovate and to design for resilience in your operations. What it really means is you have to build up a muscle for flexibility. The way you can do that best is if you can start thinking about what are those avenues that you can break down into smaller modules, and then kind of design it in such a manner that you can quickly replace it, right? So that depending upon what the unknowns throw at you, you can now do a healthy mix of permutation combination of those modules to address the turbulence that you are experiencing at an enterprise. A lot of times, like the current times, it would be beyond your enterprise into your ecosystem as well as the world at large.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And you've done a great job setting me up for this, the next section here. So I appreciate that. No, and to Darpan's point, look, the way we've looked at software and utilizing it as part of our digital transformation strategies ultimately has shifted and needs to shift, meaning if your organization has yet to make this shift and we're still operating the same way we did 2 decades ago, hopefully the rest of this presentation will shed a little bit of light on some opportunities because ultimately there's no going back to the old way of doing things. We're only going to see this become more and more of a challenge. And again, to use that word, the resiliency, driving that core component and the technical aspects that are associated to driving that change are what we're going to cover next. So with that, there's a few predictions I think that we want to state to really set the stage, and then we'll hop into sort of the solutions for these. Meaning, Darpan alluded to it, cloud is here to stay. I've been in this space my entire career. I've seen many ebbs and flows of excitement around cloud, and then certainly a contraction of the market and more excitement. And we're seeing even highly regulated industries, things like pharmaceuticals, aerospace, and defense, now having and adopting cloud-first strategies. It's really the key component that's enabling this types of transformation and composability and agility and the things that we'll get into here in a moment. I'm not going to cover the owning software is dying. It's a little bit of a harsh statement, but in reality, I think everyone who's been in technology knows that the SaaS model is here to stay. It really centered around total cost of ownership. There's a ton of content and things out there centered around that, and you all can read that at your own time. But one of the things I do want to point out is really the shift from a traditional professional services model to really a more self-serve model. Again, we've talked about it for probably a decade, the idea of citizen developers, enabling our frontline workers to be able to configure and build their own solutions and iterate on solutions. But we're actually seeing that become a reality. You're starting to see a lot more mentions of things like no code and low code. Quite frankly, every software company in the world now is looking at how we implement or how they implement a no code and low code type of strategy to assist with the configuration and the ease of use and really helping to drive that self-service model. So we say predictions here. Quite frankly, in the world I live in, they're very safe predictions, meaning we see it day in and day out. But certainly these are the foundational components that really help us get to this more resilient state that we need to based on this triple squeeze. All right, so let's look to this year and beyond. So what are we seeing in the market today? And then ultimately, how do we better position our organizations moving forward to address these future challenges? I think it's important to touch on sort of the traditional method of acquiring new solutions within an enterprise organization. And if anyone's been in this space for a while, I'm assuming the majority of you on this call have, it's really this RFP, a big bang approach where we sit together with our stakeholders, we gather all of these requirements, we hope that we get them right, because if we don't, it's going to be 5 years, 10 years until we go back and make some changes. We issue an RFP, we go to the market, 12, 18 months go by, we've selected a vendor, and now we get ready to start a project, right? And when we even begin that project, our work has just begun, right? It's another 6, 8, 12 months until we actually go live within our first site. So this type of approach, again, has done a lot for businesses and manufacturers over the years. But addressing all of the things that we mentioned earlier around this triple squeeze, how do we put a foundational system in place that helps us not only with our known problems, but with our unknowns? Again, with this approach, by the time you go live, the requirements you had 2 years ago have 100% shifted. The technology has evolved over the past 2 years. And so it's very challenging to sort of operate in this monolithic approach. In a moment, we'll talk a little bit more about a composable approach that's more bite-sized and how it helps address this concept of triple squeeze. Now, before we do that, I do want to introduce a quick survey. As we're seeing a shift in the market, we're also seeing a shift in buying behavior. And one of the things that we're obviously always looking at is who's involved in this buying process. Real quick, it is when evaluating manufacturing systems, who's the final decision maker in this buying process? Meaning, I know you'll likely have a committee that's associated in this buying process. And when we talk about this is more in lines with industrial software, manufacturing software. In this context, for today's conversation, more specifically, things on the shop floor like MES or MOM. I'm very interested to see what the results would be here and see if it sort of keeps in line with our traditional results or if it's deviated. Wow. Okay. Thank you for sharing those results. Certainly, CIO, IT leaders, it seems pretty horizontal here. Even IT leaders and plant managers, there's not a huge runaway favorite here. Quite frankly, that's sort of in line with my experience as well. There's no go-to final decision maker. It really depends on the company and certainly the business unit within the company. Now, this leads me sort of to my next topic around a buying committee and the traditional approach to the new approach, which is really focused on resilience. The traditional approach is whether it's consultants, analysts, senior management, sitting around in a conference room, using best practices that they've learned throughout their careers and really trying to structure the best solution that they feel fits the business. What we find is that quite often leaves out some of the folks that are critical and most crucial to these business processes and making these decisions. And that's the folks on the front line, meaning our frontline operators, our manufacturing engineers in the plant, and certainly our frontline managers. So the photo you see here on the right is actually a real photo, really cool photo of one of our customers I'll cover here in a moment, where it's a continuous improvement manager, the CIO, and ultimately an operator, all collaborating and iterating on a solution, collecting that real-time feedback, applying that feedback, so we get very tangible, agile applications on the shop floor that change as these different market conditions continue to change. That customer has done an awesome job of adopting this new approach, a company called Stanley Black & Decker. As I mentioned a moment ago, Sophia on the left-hand side of the screen is a continuous improvement manager. She's been given the autonomy to really fully digitally transform the facility that she works in, and ultimately they've taken a lot of those solutions and rolled them out globally across their organization. But the key takeaway here is not only involving and including our frontline management, but all the way down to the operator level, Oscar in this scenario, who certainly loved being part of this decision-making process, being involved in structuring and building the applications and the solutions that ultimately help them become more effective and efficient on the shop floor. So again, it's a shift from this pie in the sky, big bang implementation of software to how do we go to a specific line, specific cell, solve a very specific problem, and absolutely incorporate all the feedback that from our experienced operators who've been here for 5, 10, 15 years and know the process better than anyone. A little bit of graphical representation on what this looks like, right? So if you remember the previous graph that I showed, it's sort of a very linear flow of defined requirements to go live. We recommend a far more incremental approach, an iterative approach, where you start very small, as I mentioned a moment ago, at the plant, at the cell level, at the line level, solving a very specific problem, iterating on that problem, and continuing to evolve that slowly over time. So this isn't necessarily groundbreaking. Everyone says dream big, start small, but this is where we've really started to see a tremendous amount of impact within our businesses. And ultimately, it's by putting this foundational system in place that allows you to be flexible enough and agile enough to solve the challenges, the unknown challenges that Darpan alluded to within this triple squeeze environment. So as you continue to grow this up over time, add new solutions, you can learn, you see your results and learnings early. It allows you to succeed fast and it allows you to fail fast, meaning not every idea that you roll out is going to be a home run. Sometimes you're going to implement a solution and it's not the perfect fit. You certainly will always get feedback from the operators. I don't think I've ever in my career rolled out a solution that they said 100% of it is perfect and there's no changes or anything like that. I think that's a pie in the sky dream. So having the ability and flexibility to continuously adjust, see that fast value while collecting that feedback is key to this type of deployment. And ultimately, it allows you to build up over time, again, starting with the knowns, but putting a foundation in place to address these unknowns as well. Darpan, again, I know you had some great commentary at the beginning around sort of the knowns and unknowns. Not sure if you have anything that you would want to add here.
No, absolutely. I think, Patrick, so there are two things that I see here, right? One is this also kind of very well aligns with, let's say, a lot of organizations trying to adopt the agile mindset, if you will, on one side. And then on the other side, it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of, let's say, dynamically reprioritizing, if you will, right? In terms of what are those use cases that you want to consider as from the backlog that you have for the current Scrum, if you will, right? So from that perspective, I think it is kind of phenomenally aligning with I would say what the organizations are trying to do at large, as well as giving them the flexibility to align to the impacts and the results of the triple squeeze that organizations are seeing in today's time.
No, thank you. Yeah, and I think it's important to drive this home with a quick example. We'll show a few examples throughout this presentation, but one of our joint customers, AWS and Tulip's customers, Piaggio, really has taken this sort of ideology of composable and agility and really future-proofing and building out the resilience component. So they introduced it's a very innovative, Piaggio is a very innovative robotics company. They introduced a brand new robot to market. With that comes brand new processes, brand new lines, brand new operators and workforce. And when bringing something like that to market, you certainly think you know everything, but quite frankly, there's so many unknowns that can be part of that process that it's very challenging to be stuck in a very monolithic way of solving problems from a software perspective. So you have to have that agility in order to be flexible, meaning starting with one things like work instructions. It's one of the things we see most often in these scenarios. Then understanding things like traceability, how we're performing today, and slowly adding to those, but reserving the right to pivot and shift if need be. So you see some of the results down there: a full workforce train, 100% agile implementation, and now they're beginning to scale this out across their facilities. So very cool representation and practical representation of how we start small, start with one case, and then continue to build up from there. Now, I've mentioned this word a couple times around composability, right? And so it's really a system design principle that enables this types of transformation within your organizations. And it's really focused on the agility and all the other cool things that we've talked about up to this point. I'd be remiss not to mention that Tulip is specifically focused on this composable nature. You'll see this term composability become very popular. It has over the past 12 months and will continue to be prevalent throughout the industry analyst community. And the idea is, how do you, again, find a platform or a technology or a solution set that is so flexible that it helps you solve, again, your known problems? Could be production visibility and guided assembly at the beginning, but also puts a foundation in place that allows you to address the unknown problems that will come up in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, all working on a common data structure, all being completely scalable and flexible with cloud and all the cool technical components, right? So with that, Darpan, I would love to maybe hear your take on composability. I've had the opportunity to see you present on this in a couple other industry forums, and I think it'd be great to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Patrick. So I think specifically, if I try to take an example here in the context of, since we are talking manufacturing, let's say the manufacturing operation systems, as I try to refer to it in the general context, specifically it could be the MES or manufacturing execution systems or manufacturing operations management, depending upon how customers and partners prefer calling it. But if you ask me, this is a very good example of how over the period of time these systems have evolved from being a pure monolith then into more modular. But then when we still talk of modular, from a flexibility perspective, since you still have the same database, right? There is a lot of constraint in terms of the amount of flexibility and the time to value, if you will. That's where I'm seeing a lot of, I would say, customers who have built their own MESs or even the ISVs, who are, let's say, the product vendors for the systems out there. Pretty much everybody is now pivoting in terms of breaking down that monolith into a microservices-driven architecture, and also parallelly resolving, let's say, the point-to-point integration spaghetti by moving more towards, adopting the APIs for open communication, if you will. Right now, while that is being done, what I'm also seeing, interestingly, is this entire landscape is kind of also highly influenced by some of the other technology advances that we see, something like the industrial IoT platforms, a lot of progress that is being made on the edge side of things, giving you the flexibility to choose where and why you want to run a specific function or capability or a workload, whichever way you prefer calling it. On top of that, I think with the AI ML things kind of maturing pretty rapidly, it is opening up a lot of avenues for customers, both in terms of optimization as well as in terms of, let's say, growing their revenue, if you will. And not to mention, I think the low code, no code thing, which is kind of coming into the mainstream, and mainstream not in the form of competition to any of the earlier technologies, but now I see a lot of synergies across it, right? So a lot of the larger players are either trying to buy out a low code, no code platform and then kind of embed them into their products, or they are looking to partner with a leading vendor in this space, right? So net in net, if you ask me, this kind of leads into enabling what I call as value-driven innovations, right? And it's about pushing your traditional manufacturing operations systems to kind of modernize more towards a cloud-native architecture, as well as transforming the business models when it comes to making these available, let's say, for product vendors who are out there in the market space, right? Now, from a customer's perspective, what I really see is while these systems are getting powerful, it is still designed primarily to address stability, right? And when we talk about stability, I kind of think of back to what you and I referred to in terms of, let's say, how we can drive more efficiency in our operations, right? But as we kind of alluded to in the previous slides as well, Patrick, I think in the current times of triple squeeze, which is kind of bringing a lot of disruptions, you also have to think about how you can enable agility and resilience, right? And from that perspective, I think the focus has to be more in terms of moving away from what we have been traditionally doing in the form of horizontal and vertical integrations towards what I prefer calling as a multidisciplined, or think of it like a business process integration, if you will, right? And when you start thinking about it in those contexts is where you start looking at it more with a view of, let's say, breaking down the entire process across different domains. Think of a domain as something like production as a domain, quality as a domain, if you will, right? While there are, I would say, cross threads across these domains, it is, at least to begin with, it is a clear way in which you can start thinking about how you should be breaking it down. Once you do that is where you start adopting this concept of what is called as composable thinking, so that you can now start reimagining some of these business processes in terms of how you can make them more self-contained at a domain level or at a functional level, or if you look at it from a systems perspective, it could be not just at a system level, but at a subsystem and at a component level as well, right? And while you do that, the focus has to be in terms of how you are enabling each of these modules so that you can then end up with a more collaborative interplay between these modules as well as interoperability across these modules. And the reason I'm stressing more on the interoperability aspect is while today we see that most of this is, let's say, coming from just one vendor, in the near future, I expect that a lot of these modules will start playing across each other, right? So think of you having maybe 10 modules out there, and then you could be building these modules either by yourself using different technologies, or some of these modules could come from some of your existing partners. The point being, not necessarily all of these modules coming from just one partner, right? So that's where the interoperability and the vendor agnostic thing is what I would like to stress upon as I highlight, breaking down your business process into those modular business capabilities, if you will. And again, what I have here is, let's say, few statistics picked up from some of the recent Gartner reports. Primarily, it all underlines the increasing play of augmenting whatever core systems. In our case, we are talking about manufacturing operations here with cloud-native composable apps. Typically, these days, I'm seeing that these are being built using low-code, no-code platforms. Yes, some of these are also bolted on, let's say, by building an app leveraging an industrial IoT platform, if you will. But the point being, technology really doesn't matter much as long as you know what is the end goal, which is about breaking down your business process into modular capabilities, if you will, right? So that you then start addressing all the business basically empowering your business users so that they can start assembling it based on what is really required, aligned to the business outcomes that they are trying to achieve through this exercise, if you will, right? And again, if I may just continue in terms of giving you, or let's say supporting this with some of the examples that Patrick, you and I have been seeing, right? I think what we see is in the context of manufacturing operations, right? We are seeing customers leverage this, I would say, mindset as well as the tooling to kind of start composing their core systems to begin with, right? And when we talk of core systems, this could be just the MES standalone. So think of it like you have invested in an existing MES. You don't want to rip and replace it. What you want to do is leave and layer it, if you will, right? So by leave and layer, what I mean is kind of retain whatever you have, and then in terms of the additional capabilities and functionalities that you need, you just kind of figure out what's the best way in which you are going to build those bolt-on applications, if you will, right? Now these applications are going to empower your users, and the reason I'm using the word empowered is, again, there is a shift there that we see as well, right? So with a lot of these bolt-on approaches, what we are seeing is you no longer are dependent on, let's say, your IT folks to kind of build those apps and add those features and functionalities. You can actually start leveraging a lot of the people who are the users here, right? And it could be anywhere in between as well, depending upon what you intend to build with some of these technologies, right? But the point is, end of the day, it kind of accelerates the digitization of those business capabilities that you are expecting to kind of support you as you kind of move towards the agility goal that your organization has set up for yourself. And one very I would say one very common use case that I see when we look at it from a live and layer perspective is customers trying to move more from a paper-based standard operating procedures that a lot of their operators have been used to. And I would say for those times it was not wrong, right? If we look at automotive as an example, I think what we have seen is, let's say 3 years, 5 years prior, if you have a new model that is introduced in the market, it would be there at least for 7 to 10 years. But now if you look at what is now typically referred to as the refresh rates in those industries, I think a lot of those refresh rates have moved down to less than a year at this point in time. And with what it really means is you are going to have a lot more variety and SKUs on the shop floor, increasing the possibility of your operators making mistakes, right? So that's where I think it makes sense to kind of move away from those paper-based operations into what we call as, or what our customers prefer calling as, paperless operations, essentially guiding your frontline operators in terms of what they should be doing for the job in front of them, right? To simplify that. The other way that we are seeing is in terms of customers increasingly leveraging this to kind of fill in the gaps, if you will, right? And when I talk about filling in the gaps, on the slide here, you see a lot of core systems like MES, MOM being one system, your PLM being the other system. The ERP is typically what you would see as the third system of record. But then if you start looking at it from a functionality perspective, right, while there might be overlaps across these core systems, there are still a lot of, I would say, gaps in terms of the features that each of this system can enable compared to the overall business process that a customer would have set up, right? Now, what we are seeing is, again, these capabilities in terms of composing apps to kind of fill in that gap is another area where we have been seeing a lot of customers leveraging these technologies, right? And one example I can call out here is, let's say, for example, unifying the user experience, right? So now I don't want my user to kind of hop across different tabs, on their computer if they want to kind of, let's say, enter something into their ERP versus reconcile that with their MES as an example, right? We can then have that unified in the form of a single pane of glass, if you will, as one example. The other example, I think, Patrick, that you can touch upon on the next slide is where customers are using it for enabling an end-to-end traceability as an example, right? So I think the avenues are just limited to what we can reimagine in terms of adopting this building block of what Gartner calls as composable thinking, if you will, Patrick. So, yep.
No, very good. Thank you. I think you brought up a very interesting point about how do we provide a single interface for our knowledge worker to access all the data they need. I think in the back office and outside of our frontline workers on the shop floor, as a whole, we've done a good job as an industry. I think when we look at the operational side of the house, there's largely been missing, or there's been a gap with simplifying and unifying the user experience. The user experience on the shop floor, quite frankly, has been overlooked for the past 2 decades, right? And so that's a major area of focus. When we talk about this new buying committee and people that need to be involved in these processes, it really needs to include the folks that interact with this on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, you're spot on there. I think the example you're referring to is another great joint customer between us, AWS and Tulip. It's a high-end jewelry manufacturer out of Switzerland. Very similar to what Darpan mentioned in the last slide, where they have many systems of record that they've deployed over the past 10, 20, 30 years. They've built up a lot of logic and data. The idea of ripping and replacing, embarking on this 5-year journey to get something new in is very daunting and overwhelming. And in this context, it's an augment and extend situation where you come in and you put a system like Tulip on top of those existing systems of record, provide that simplified user interface, allow them to start small with one use case in one area. And now over time, they've rolled out dozens and dozens of use cases across multiple facilities. You see some of the results down here, over 100 hours saved daily in administrative tasks for operators. There's also the cost avoidance of ripping and replacing existing MESs by just putting some simplistic workflows and applications on top of those systems of record. I know we're coming up on time here, and I promised to leave time towards the end for questions. So I'm going to run through this a little bit quicker. There's another company in Terex that, again, great joint customer of ours, who had a very similar approach. So very global, multinational, widely distributed company, trying to solve many problems within their operations. So very similar, started in one facility, one line with digital work instructions. Over time, they moved through tracking throughput, and traceability. And now they have dozens and dozens of applications scaled globally, but started small and were able to put this foundational system in place that allowed them to be agile and address and adapt to all these unknown challenges. All right, so that was sort of what we wanted to talk about, where we see the future of going and provide a few examples. Darpan, I'd like to get a little bit more tactical and say, if we agree with this approach, what are some things that we should be thinking of moving forward, potentially adopting within our organization, and how do we best recommend navigating this squeeze?
Absolutely, Patrick. And as you promised, I'll try to be brief here as well, right? Because I think we can talk over this for hours together. But just to sum it up, I think while there is flexibility depending upon each customer situation in terms of how you do it, I would say the starting point invariably is going to be the composable thinking element, right? And it all comes down to having this belief that anything can be composed, right? So first of all, that's I would say the change in the mindset that is required. Now, once you start believing in that and then start looking at it from that lens, it's all about identifying what are those movements of composability, as you will, right? And these movements could come from an external event, something like what we have been alluding to as in the form of triple squeeze, or it could be from an internal event, right? So think of a lot of our customers that we talk to are kind of planning in terms of how they can run initiatives like Lean, Six Sigma, continuous improvements. So it could come from one of those internal events as well. Now, irrespective of where it comes from, the key is in terms of for each of those opportunity, we should start thinking about who is going to be the composer in my scenario, right? And once we know who the composer is, we then have to figure out what are going to be the deliverables, right? What are those business capabilities or components that we want to derive out of it? And once we have that, we also have to be very clear in terms of how we tie it back to what is the business value that it is going to enable, right? I think once we have this, which is, I would say, more than 50% of the part figured out, this is where it will, and we kind of start putting it together, is where we'll be able to start seeing those patterns in terms of how we can enable speed and agility by giving them the right tools, if you will, right? So that's where the bottoms up that you see on the slide here in terms of the platform and the components start coming in. Now, once you do that, you are setting up the team for rapid innovation, right? And this is where I think, especially in the context of manufacturing, where I know that historically, this as a customer segment has been very risk averse, right? I think the most critical element is to have the right governance in place, right? And once you kind of have that, I would say in terms of the governance, I would like to emphasize on one point here, Patrick, that when I talk governance, I'm not talking about locking down things, right? I'm talking about building those guardrails versus dictating that this is how things should be done, right? We need to give the developers the flexibility on one side, but then on the other side, we also have to be very careful in terms of ensuring that whatever is built is repeatable, whatever is built is interoperable, whatever is built complies to the organizational security practices, right? Those are some of the no-go things that we want to bundle up as part of guardrails when we are thinking governance here.
Yep. No, you're spot on. And if I could take it even a little bit deeper. So that's from an sort of a broader organizational perspective. Both you and I spend a lot of time walking on shop floors, doing gimbal walks, trying to identify areas of opportunity. I quite often get asked, okay, we've identified 12 areas of opportunity or 12 problems we need to solve. How do we begin to even go deeper and understand specifically which use case should we start with, right? And quite often when you leave an ideation session, you'll have a list of 20 different things that you need to solve or want to solve. But what becomes the highest priority item or use case, what we call in the top right box here, sort of the low-hanging fruit priority one box. And it really becomes a stack ranking exercise between business impact and ease of implementation. Where are you going to get your quickest return? Where are you going to get your quickest value? And so that's sort of an additional exercise. So once you get your organizational structure in place, going down to the plant level and really identifying these areas of opportunity, stack ranking them, and figuring out where to get the biggest bang for your buck. And then ultimately taking that one use case, that one problem you're trying to solve, and start there. Don't try to solve everything at once. Start very tactically and move forward from that component.
So I cannot, I would say allude more, Patrick, to what you just kind of called out. And if I were to just call out, I think some wise man once said, right, I think insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So I think now's the time, if we want to truly architect a resilient and an adaptive business, organizations will have to be more intentional about making it real, right? I think that's what I would kind of call out. And in terms of how they do that, how they are going to democratize by empowering their, I would say, not just their IT, let's say not just the developers on their IT side, but also a lot of composers who now sit on the business and in between. I think Gartner refers to that as the business technologist role now as part of a fusion team. So again, keeping all those jargons away, right? It's all about how we then empower them to develop and leverage the power of their ecosystem as well, right? Because when we start thinking composable, and then I refer to the external events, right? I think in my view, the larger the ecosystem that you have, the more power you will have in terms of sensing the upcoming disruptions or trends that are going to impact you, and then kind of serving as, I would say, as a guardian light in terms of what should be your response in terms of what are the capabilities that you should be composing so that you are going to be more agile and resilient the time it kind of comes and hits you, right? So, yep. What do you, Patrick?
No, and again, I think we would be remiss not to mention that by teaming up with AWS, we've done some pretty cool things over the past several years, and we'll continue to produce a lot of great solutions together. But it's really centered in these 4 components that Darpan had mentioned. With that, we've really focused on 2 major areas, what we call Cloud MES on AWS. MES was really one of the leaders in microservice organization. Really, this concept of composability from a microservices perspective, it laid the foundation for companies like Tulip to even exist, a decade or 2 later. And so we work extremely well together in bringing to market a very agile, flexible way of solving all of these challenges, everything that we've mentioned throughout this conversation, empowered by the services and scalability and know-how and knowledge that not only the Tulip team brings from manufacturing perspective, but the AWS team brings from their own perspective. I think there's one last thing I want to mention when talking about composability. One of the things that's obviously a hot topic now are things like AI and how we leverage that within our operations as well. There's another area that we work very closely with AWS on, and it's around computer vision. And so it's being able to detect anomalies and understand, in this context of this example, are we shipping out all the right parts in a box before it gets sent to a customer? And again, it alludes to the changing nature of an environment. This example is a company called Laerdal. A manufacturing engineer had a major issue with shipping out components to customers that were missing parts. I think it was a 30 or 40% issue for them at the time. Because of the composable nature, within a day, they were able to go and configure this solution. Again, it was an unknown solution until it was presented to this engineer, right? And they were able to go configure this and actually deploy it. And you see the results here at the bottom: 0 defects reported, 0 shipping missing parts moving forward to customers. So it's this very tactical, in a couple hours or a couple days, being able to solve these problems. It's paramount to our manufacturing operations moving forward, and certainly a technology that's flexible enough to address those. Again, folks, there's sort of 3 key takeaways that we want to drive home here. It's really this focus on resiliency and developing resiliency in your operation. So not just focusing on efficiencies, which has been the core area of focus for all manufacturing historically. We need to adopt this more resilient mindset. Secondly, digitization must result in adaptable systems. So we need agile, we need flexible, we need composable, we need extensible. All those words that I just mentioned certainly play a big component here. And that will allow you to set up for addressing not only the knowns, but more importantly, under this triple squeeze concept, how do we position our company, position our organization to be prepared to address these unknowns? So that's what we wanted to deliver today. Certainly, we could spend a lot more time on this topic. I would ask that if you would like to continue this conversation or have any additional comments, or we aren't able to get to your questions today, please feel free to reach out to us directly, Tulip and or AWS, Darpan, or myself. We certainly appreciate everyone's time. I know taking an hour out midweek to join a webinar is not easy, so it doesn't go unnoticed, and we really, really appreciate everyone's support and time to attend that.
Thank you, Patrick and Darpan. So yes, let's get right into the Q&A session. Can you explain the concept of triple squeeze a little more?
So it's really the idea of 3 different unique challenges in inflation and labor shortage and supply chain issues coming down on the manufacturing industry at one time. So it's sort of, if you think of the instant image that comes to me is if you're in a room and all the walls are closing in at once. That's really where this idea is centered around. Usually, within turbulent times, you might face 1 or 2 of these challenges. For example, at the beginning of 2020 or mid-COVID times, supply chain and labor challenges were certainly the 2 constants. Now we added additional challenges of inflation, which again, we're anticipating to be here to stay for at least the short term. And it's becoming this triple squeeze on an already industry that needs to innovate, or manufacturers who have failed. What's the polite way to put this? So it's an industry that's been stuck in the past, and this triple squeeze is really bringing a lot of the shortcomings to light in the areas that need to be improved, and that's sort of my take on it. Darpan, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
No, 100%, Patrick. I think it's basically it's not new in terms of these trends impacting the industry, right? I think the reason why there is a lot more emphasis now is the fact that all of this is coming and hitting us together at one time, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, yeah.
Next question. Can you explain the difference between low-no code or custom solutions with an eye towards speaking to knowledge and maintenance cost?
Yeah, so the idea of low code and no code, as I alluded to earlier, is really a means to an end. So what's the end result you're trying to get with any software development? You're trying to get a solution that makes you more efficient, productive, safer, whatever the outcome you're looking for is. No code is becoming the way to configure that solution easier. And what that's allowing us to do is move the responsibility of configuring applications or building applications from developers or IT-centric folks who might not know the process very well. And it shifts it to the subject matter expert who knows the process and allows them to rapidly configure and iterate and build applications on their own. So the idea is, how do we simplify, forget the technical components, it's just how do we make our end users' lives easier, that if we give them a solution and they want to make a change, they can make that change much faster on their own and more of a self-service model than having to rely on others to come in and very expensive costs in doing so.
Yeah, and if I may just add there, I think the second part of the question was more in the context of knowledge and maintenance costs. I think the knowledge part is something that is really required, right? Whether it is the pro code developer who kind of develops it for the end user or the end user building it themselves, unless they know what they are building for, it's not going to serve the purpose, right? So that knowledge thing is something I would say that is common there, but the difference is in terms of the maintenance costs, right? So if it is majorly a pro code thing, you really need people of those skills in the longer run as well, right? To kind of continue maintaining that, probably enhancing and upgrading that as well, right? Whereas when it comes to the low code, no code side of things, the fact that you can build it more modular, let's assume that something is not really required or something is outdated, you have the liberty and luxury to kind of now build that from scratch and then kind of just swap it with the code that you no longer need, right? So, yep.
So you mentioned digital work instructions as kind of a primary pain point manufacturers have been focusing on solving. What other primary pain points, priority pain points, do you see manufacturers addressing?
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot would depend upon where the manufacturer is starting from, if you ask me, right? What's their existing footprint when we are looking at it from their manufacturing IT landscape perspective? But in general, I see that, you should try and classify that broadly into whether it is a more automated process, which is where the focus will be more towards, let's say, how you integrate and automate the data flow, if you will, both the data and the events. And then on the other side, if it is a lot more manual process, right, is where I think typically it starts off by replacing the paper that you see on the shop floor, right, which is where we talk about paperless operations in general, and digital work instruction is a part of it, right? A lot of times you would see that there would be cards for maintaining the traceability that kind of go along as the product moves through its manufacturing process, as an example. There would be a lot of paper that kind of goes in as part of the quality process, which kind of gets replaced when we talk about the paperless operations, right? So those are the first things. The second thing is in terms of visibility, right? What the typical challenge that you see with a paper-based operation is, it is very typical for manufacturers to consolidate, let's say, all those information at the end of the shift, and the earliest you will be able to get any insights out of it is only in the next shift, right? Which is kind of looking in your rear view mirror, if you will, right? Whereas if you now start digitizing this, you can get this data instantly, if you will, right? So more real time, as manufacturers prefer calling it. So those are some of the very common things that we see, irrespective of whatever is the starting position for a given manufacturer. Patrick, you would like to add there, or I think it's...
No, I think you covered it well. If you would like to see some examples of that, I know specifically on our Tulip website, there's what we call the library. There's about 150 different templates of areas that people start with outside of work instruction. So please feel free to visit that.
Yep.
And gentlemen, this will be our last question. It's a good one to end on. How long do you foresee the triple squeeze continuing to impact the manufacturing industry? Do you think these conditions will lead to any additional challenges in the coming years besides the ones we're already seeing?
That's an interesting question, if you will. Well, in my view, if we stick to the specific point of triple squeeze, I think it is not short-termed. I expect that to at least continue this year, and unfortunately, at least the first part of next year as well. That's my guess here. But in terms of the general theme, right, it's not just triple squeeze, which is kind of forcing you to now start thinking in a more composable manner. I would say, in general, what I'm seeing is those disruptions, the waves of disruptions that have been coming are so. Historically, if you see, those waves would come probably once every 7 years, 8 years, and then the recovery would also take time. In my view, now what I'm seeing is the reasons for this disruption kind of keep changing, but the frequency at which they are hitting us has increased dramatically, right? So from that perspective, triple squeeze specifically, my best bet is at least another year or two. Unfortunate, but that's how I see it. And then in terms of the broader disruptions, I think it is here to stay, as I started off with, right? I think change is going to be the only constant. Patrick, your view?
No, I think you covered it well, Darpan.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Patrick Harrigan and Darpan Parikh, and our sponsor, Tulip, for today's presentation. And on behalf of Industry Week, we hope you have a productive remainder of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.